Some men leave quietly. They pack their things, they say sorry, and they go. But some men do not just leave. They burn everything down on their way out the door. They take your name, your reputation, your confidence, and your peace. Then they invite you to watch them dance on the ashes. My name is Clara Whitfield. And the man I gave 11 years of my life to did not just leave me. He destroyed me in front of all of London. He took everything I helped him build, handed it to a younger woman, and then had the nerve to show up at the biggest charity gala of the year with her on his arm, expecting me to sit quietly at my table and smile through my tears. He thought he had won. He thought the story was over. He had no idea that 3 months before that night, I had met someone in a quiet museum archive, a man who introduced himself simply as Edward. A man with kind eyes and a warm laugh, and a way of listening that made me feel like I was the most interesting person in the world. A man who was not who he said he was. Not even close. Tonight was supposed to be Daniel's greatest triumph. Instead, it became the night he lost everything. And I watched every single second of it. If you love a good story about betrayal, karma, and a woman who came back stronger than ever, you are in the right place. Make sure you hit that like button right now and subscribe to our channel so you never miss a story like this one. Now let us get into it. I want you to understand something before I tell you what happened at that gala. I want you to understand who I was before Daniel Hartwell came into my life, and who I became because of him, and who I became after he was done with me. I grew up in a small town called Ashford in the English countryside. My mother was a school teacher. My father fixed cars for a living. We did not have much money, but we had a warm home and a full table and parents who loved each other loudly and without shame. I studied art history at university on a full scholarship because I worked hard and I cared deeply about beautiful things. After I graduated, I got a job at the Victoria and Albert Museum in London as a junior art restorer. I was 23 years old, and I thought London was the most magical place on earth. Art restoration is a quiet, patient job. You take something that is broken or damaged or faded, and you bring it back to life. You work with tiny brushes and magnifying glasses, and you spend weeks on a single painting. People do not understand the work until they see the before and the after, until they see what something looked like when it came to you, cracked and dark and forgotten, and what it looks like when you are done with it, breathing and golden and whole again. I loved that work more than I can tell you. It was not just a job to me. It was who I was. I met Daniel Hartwell at a fundraising event for the museum. He was 28 tall, with sharp dark eyes and a smile that made you feel like you were standing in a spotlight. He told me he was starting his own investment firm. He had a small office in Shoreditch, second floor, no lift, a second-hand desk, and a borrowed laptop that kept shutting down on him. He had ambition the size of a building, but he had no money, and he had no connections, and he had no idea how to move in the kinds of rooms that would take him where he wanted to go. What he had was me. I believed in Daniel before anyone else did. I was the one who paid the rent on that Shoreditch office for the first 2 years, while his firm found its feet. I was the one who stayed up with him until 2 in the morning going over investor pitches. I was the one who sat across from him at our kitchen table and played the role of a skeptical investor over and over until he had his answers smooth and confident and ready. I was the one who made his rough edges softer. I hosted dinners for the kind of people who could open doors for him. I learned what wines they liked, and what subjects made them relax, and what questions made them feel important. I wore the right dresses, and said the right things and smiled until my face hurt. I did all of that because I loved him, because I believed in what we were building together. By the time Daniel's firm, Hartwell Capital, became one of the most talked about investment firms in the city of London, nobody remembered the Shoreditch office or the borrowed laptop or the woman who had kept the lights on. What they saw was a brilliant, self-made man with a beautiful wife on his arm and a penthouse in Mayfair and a box at the opera and a waiting list of clients who wanted to give him their money. What they did not see was that the beautiful wife on his arm was quietly exhausted, was slowly disappearing, was beginning to understand that the man she had believed in so completely did not see her the way she saw him. He saw me as part of the furniture. Something useful and presentable that belonged in the background of his life. Not a partner, not a person, a prop. I knew something was wrong for about a year before I found out the truth. Little things. Phone calls he took in another room, business trips that lasted longer than they needed to. a distance in his eyes when he looked at me, like he was already somewhere else. I told myself I was imagining it. I told myself that successful men were busy and distracted, and that this was just what marriage looked like after a decade. I told myself these things because the alternative was too painful to hold. Then one Tuesday morning in November, his phone slipped out of the pocket of his suit jacket while he was in the shower. It landed on the bathroom floor screen up, and the name on the notification was not a client. It was not a colleague. It was a woman named Sienna Cole. And the message she had sent him at 7:30 in the morning was not the kind of message you send to someone you work with. I stood there in the bathroom doorway in my dressing gown, holding his phone, and I felt the entire world tip sideways. Not all at once like a crash. More like the slow, terrifying feeling of standing on a deck that is beginning to lean and knowing that in a few seconds you are going to fall and there is nothing you can do to stop it. He came out of the shower. He saw my face. He saw his phone in my hand. He did not apologize. He did not cry. He pulled the phone out of my fingers gently, the way you take something dangerous away from a child, and he said, "Clara, I think it is time we had an honest conversation." That conversation lasted 40 minutes. By the end of it, I knew 3 things. 1, he had been seeing Sienna Cole for 8 months. 2, he was in love with her, or at least he believed he was. 3, he wanted a divorce, and he wanted it as quickly and quietly as possible. I want to be honest with you. The first 2 weeks after Daniel told me he wanted a divorce, I was not strong. I was not dignified. I was not any of the things I like to think I am. I cried in the bath. I stopped eating properly. I sat on the floor of the kitchen we had chosen together, and I stared at the walls, and I could not make myself stand up. My sister Alina came and stayed with me, and she made me toast and sat with me through the nights, and she did not tell me to be strong or to move on or to look on the bright side. She just sat with me. That was the right thing to do, and I am grateful to her every single day. But here is what I did not know while I was sitting on that kitchen floor. I did not know that Daniel was not just leaving me. He was already building a case against me. He was afraid. Not guilty, not ashamed, afraid. He was afraid that his high-profile investors would see the divorce as a sign of instability. He was afraid that word would get out that his wife had left him, or worse, that she had caught him. So he decided the safest thing to do was to destroy my reputation before I could destroy his. He hired the most aggressive divorce solicitors in Mayfair, men who were known for making the opposing party look as bad as possible. He froze every joint account we had before I even knew he had spoken to a lawyer. I went to use my card at the supermarket, and it was declined. I stood at the till with my basket and my card that did not work, and I felt the shame climb up my neck like heat. Then he started talking to the press. Not directly, not with his name attached, but through people who worked for him, through careful whispers dropped into the right ears at the right parties. Within 3 weeks, the story that was circulating in London society was that Clara Hartwell had been a cold and difficult wife who had never been able to keep up with her husband's world. That she was out of touch, socially rigid, more interested in her old paintings than in supporting her husband's career. That Daniel had been lonely for years. Every single word of that was a lie. But lies told quietly and often enough begin to sound like truth. I started to see it in the way people looked at me at events. A slight pulling back, a politeness that had replaced warmth. Friends who had sat at my dinner table calling to cancel plans. I had given 11 years of my life to building a social world that supported Daniel's career, and he had turned that same world against me in under a month. And then there was Sienna. Sienna Cole was 24 years old. She had been a contestant on a popular reality television program 2 years earlier. She had not won, but she had come across as likable enough to build a following on social media, which she had then parlayed into a job as a lifestyle and PR consultant. She was beautiful in a bright, obvious way. She had long blonde hair and a wardrobe full of things that were clearly expensive, and she knew how to work a camera and a room. She was not a bad person, I do not think. But she was very young, and she was very dazzled by Daniel, and she had no idea, yet, what kind of man she was standing next to. She moved into a serviced apartment that Daniel paid for in Kensington. Within 6 weeks of our separation, she was on his arm at a hedge fund dinner. Within 8 weeks, her picture was in Tatler. Within 10 weeks, she had a yellow diamond ring on her left hand that was, by all accounts, significantly larger than the one I had worn. I sat with all of this. I sat with the frozen accounts, and the whispers and the social withdrawal and the photographs of Sienna's ring in the gossip columns. I sat with it because I was still, in those early months, in survival mode. I was focused on getting through each day. I was focused on keeping my job at the museum. I was focused on finding a flat I could afford on my salary alone now that the joint accounts were locked. What I was not focused on, what I could not have predicted, was that my salvation was already sitting in a locked archive 2 floors below my office at the museum, waiting for me to walk through the door. I want you to picture the archive room at the Victoria and Albert Museum. It is in the basement. It is temperature controlled, which means it is always a little cold, and it smells of old paper and preservation chemicals and something else underneath that, something warm and ancient, like the smell of time itself. The lighting is soft and directed. There are long wooden tables and careful shelves, and everything is very quiet. I loved that room. When things were difficult upstairs in my life, going into the archive felt like stepping into another world where nothing could reach me. It was a Wednesday in January, about 6 weeks after Daniel had told me about Sienna, when the museum director brought someone down to the archive to see me. His name was Dr. Philip Morris, a very formal and slightly nervous man who managed acquisitions. He knocked on the archive door and leaned in and said, "Clara, I have someone here who would like to consult with you on a private matter." He is a collector seeking advice on a series of damaged Flemish portraits belonging to his family estate. I hope you do not mind. I did not mind. Private consultation requests were not unusual. Wealthy collectors with damaged artwork in their homes came to us from time to time for discreet expert advice. I was used to it. The man who walked into the archive behind Dr. Morris was tall, very tall. He had broad shoulders and dark brown hair with a little gray at the temples, and he was wearing a dark navy coat that was expensive without being showy. He had the posture of someone who had been taught from childhood to stand straight. His eyes were hazel, a warm brown-green, and they moved around the archive with genuine curiosity before they found me. When they found me, he smiled. Not a polished smile, a real one. The kind that reaches the eyes. He said, "Hello, I am Edward. I apologize for descending on you without much notice. I am told you are the best person in the building to help me with what I have brought." Dr. Morris quietly left. I asked Edward to sit, and I asked him to describe the portraits, and he did, in surprisingly good detail for a non-specialist. He had photographs on a tablet. 5 Flemish portraits from the early 17th century, a family grouping, oil on oak panel, with significant craquelure across 3 of them, and what appeared to be amateur overpainting on one. They were beautiful underneath the damage. I could see that immediately. We talked for 2 hours. He asked intelligent questions. He leaned in to look at the photographs with me, and his arm was warm next to mine on the table, and I noticed that and then immediately told myself to stop noticing things like that. I was 6 weeks out of an 11-year marriage. I was not in any condition to notice anything about anyone. When he stood to leave, he paused at the door and said, "May I come back Thursday? I have more photographs, and I would like your opinion on the varnish removal process before I make any decisions." I said yes. He came back Thursday. He came back the Thursday after that, too. And the Thursday after that. Within a month, what had started as professional consultations had become something else. He would arrive before our appointment time and wait in the corridor with 2 cups of tea from the museum cafe, one for me, the right amount of milk, which he had noticed without asking. He brought me a first edition of Keats' poetry one Thursday, just tucked under his arm as if it was nothing. He handed it to me and said, "I thought of you when I saw this." He did not explain why. He did not need to. I taught him how to spot a forged brushstroke. He told me about a painting his mother had loved in their house when he was a child, a small landscape of the Scottish coast, and how he had never been able to find another one that felt the same. The way he talked about it, quietly and without embarrassment, told me a great deal about who he was. Our archive meetings became lunches at a small Italian place in South Kensington where nobody seemed to notice him, which I thought was slightly odd but did not question. Those lunches became long rainy walks through Richmond Park. He would arrive in a dark car, and we would walk for hours in the rain, talking about everything and nothing, and he would make me laugh in the way that real laughter works, unexpectedly, from somewhere deep. When something made him laugh, he threw his head back, and it was genuine and warm and completely unguarded. He told me his full name was Edward James Ashby, and that he managed his family estate in Berkshire. He did not volunteer much more than that. I did not push. I was, I think, a little afraid to know too much. What we had in those quiet museum hours and those rainy park walks felt delicate and rare, and I did not want to put too much weight on it too quickly in case it broke. I was also still technically in the middle of a divorce. My solicitor, a very capable woman named Helen Graves, who Daniel's lawyers had badly underestimated, was working through the financial settlement. I was keeping my head down. I was not supposed to be falling in love in a museum archive basement. And yet, it was about 2 months into knowing Edward when I accidentally dropped my magnifying loupe on the archive floor and muttered something quite rude under my breath before I could stop myself. Edward looked at me for 1 second, and then he let out a laugh so big and so sudden that it bounced off the marble walls and echoed down the corridor. It was the least guarded I had ever seen him, and I laughed too, surprised. And for a few minutes we were just two people laughing in a quiet room and nothing else existed. That was the moment I knew I was in serious trouble. I did not know yet, still, who he truly was. That revelation came later. It came in a way I was not prepared for, and it changed everything. The invitation arrived on a Tuesday morning in March. A thick cream envelope with the Hargrove Foundation emblem embossed on the front in gold. Inside was an invitation to the annual Hargrove Charity Gala, the most prestigious social event on the London calendar. Held every year in the grand ballroom of the Hargrove Hall in Belgravia. Black tie. The kind of evening where you needed to know someone to get a seat, and where the waiting list for tables had a waiting list of its own. I had attended this gala every year for 9 years as Daniel's wife. My name was on the guest list because I had personally helped organize the museum's contribution to the auction for the past 4 years. They had kept me on regardless of the divorce. It was a small and quiet kindness from the foundation's chairwoman, Lady Dorothea Hargrove herself, who had always liked me and who had very pointedly not returned any of Daniel's social calls since the separation. I set the invitation on my kitchen table and looked at it for a long time. I knew Daniel would be there. Of course he would be there. Hartwell Capital sponsored one of the main tables every year. A 5-figure donation that bought him visibility and access and the opportunity to work the room. I knew Sienna would be on his arm. I knew that my presence at the same event would be noted by everyone, and that every single person in that room would be watching to see how I handled it. My first instinct was to decline, to stay home, to protect myself from an evening of quiet cruelty and performative pity. Then my sister Alina called. I told her about the invitation. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Clara, I want you to think about something. You built that world. You were a part of that gala for 9 years. You raised money for those charities. You have friends in that room who actually like you. Why should you give all of that up because Daniel is going to be there with his new toy? You have just as much right to be in that room as he does. More, actually, because you were there for the right reasons." I sat with that for 2 days. Then I called my friend Rosie, who had stuck by me through everything and who had strong opinions about dramatic exits and even stronger opinions about dramatic returns, and I told her I was going and I needed a dress. Rosie said finally, and we went shopping that weekend. Now here is the thing I have not told you yet. The thing that was happening quietly on a different track while I was deciding about the gala. About 2 weeks before the invitation arrived, Edward had called me one evening and said he wanted to tell me something. That he had been meaning to tell me for a while, and that he had not known how, and that he was sorry for the delay because I deserved honesty, and he had not been entirely honest with me. He said he would like to come to the museum the following morning if I was willing to hear him out. I said yes. I spent the evening in a state of quiet dread, convinced he was about to tell me he was married, or that the consultations were ending, or something else that would take away the one good thing that had happened to me in months. He arrived the next morning not at the archive, but at the front entrance of the museum. He was standing outside in the cold when I got there. His collar was turned up and he looked, for the first time since I had known him, slightly nervous. There were 2 men standing nearby at a distance that was close enough to be deliberate. I had noticed men like that before on our walks. I had assumed they were security for someone nearby. I had not asked. I was beginning to understand that I should have asked. Edward said, "Clara, I need to tell you my full name." My full name is His Royal Highness Prince Edward James Ashby, the Duke of Westbourne. He said it quickly and quietly, the way you rip off a plaster, and then he looked at me and waited. I looked at him for a long time. Then I looked at the two men standing at a careful distance. Then I looked back at him. I said, "The Duke of Westbourne." He said, "Yes." I said, "The Duke of Westbourne who did not know how to describe Crackalure when he came into my archive in January." He said, "I knew what Crackalure was. I may have slightly understated my knowledge of Flemish portraiture to have a reason to keep coming back." I turned around and walked back into the museum. He followed me, which I suppose I expected. He talked for quite a long time. He told me that he had attended the museum donor event in the autumn and had seen me across the room talking to a group of conservation students, explaining something about pigment degradation with so much enthusiasm that he had stood watching for several minutes before Dr. Morris found him and steered him away. He had asked about me afterward. He had arranged the Flemish portrait consultation specifically so he would have a reason to meet me. He told me that every Thursday in that archive had been real. Every walk had been real. Every cup of tea with the right amount of milk had been real. I said, "You are a prince." He said, "I know." I said, "And you did not tell me for 4 months." He said, "I wanted you to know me first, before the title, before everything that comes with it. I wanted to know if you would like me, just me." He paused and then said, "Do you?" I was quiet for a moment. Then I said, "Yes, Edward, I do. I very much do. But this is a lot to absorb and I would like some time, please." He said, "Of course. Take all the time you need. I am not going anywhere." What he said next surprised me more than anything else. He said, "Clara, I know about your situation with your former husband. I am not going to pretend I do not. And I want you to know that when you are ready, if you would like to attend the Hargrove Gala next month, I would be very glad to escort you." He smiled then, quiet and steady, and said, "I imagine it would make for an interesting evening." I called Rosie immediately after he left. I told her to find a better dress. The week before the gala, I barely slept. Not from nerves exactly, or not only from nerves. Something had shifted in me over those months. The woman who had sat on the kitchen floor in the weeks after Daniel left was not the woman getting ready for this evening. I was not healed, not completely. You do not heal from 11 years of your life being dismantled in a few months. But I was standing again. I was solid under my own feet. My dress was ivory silk, full length, with a neckline that was elegant rather than trying too hard. Rosie had very firm opinions about this. She said, "You are not going there to compete with Sienna Cole on her terms. You are going there to remind every person in that room who you actually are. Ivory. Classic. Done." She was right. She was almost always right about things like this. I wore my grandmother's pearl earrings. Small and real and old. I wore my hair up, simply the way I had always worn it to these events because it was the way that felt like me. I wore low heels because I had never been comfortable in anything higher, and I had decided, somewhere in the last few months, to stop doing things that made me uncomfortable for the sake of appearances. Edward had told me that he would arrive at the gala shortly after the main guests had been seated. He said his entry would be announced, as it always was at these events, and that I should go in ahead of him and take my seat at the museum table. He said, "Clara, when you walk into that room, walk in as yourself, not as anyone's wife, not as anyone's ex-wife, as yourself. Can you do that?" I said I could, and I meant it. Now let me tell you what was happening on the other side of the city while I was getting ready. Daniel Hartwell had woken up that morning feeling, by all accounts, extremely pleased with himself. His firm had had a strong quarter. He had recently secured what he believed was a preliminary commitment from a consortium of Japanese investors, a group called Kyoto Dynamics, for a partnership that could elevate Hartwell Capital into a completely different tier of the financial world. He had a new fiancée with a large yellow diamond ring who photographed beautifully. He had a table at the Hargrove Gala directly adjacent to the museum table. He had arranged that specifically. He had paid extra for that placement. He was, in other words, planning an evening of quiet cruelty. He wanted to sit close enough to me to make his happiness visible. He wanted to introduce Sienna to everyone we both knew while I watched from 2 meters away. He wanted to see me flinch. Sienna, for her part, had spent a significant amount of money on a red dress with a neckline that required significant confidence to wear. She had had her hair and makeup done professionally. She was wearing the yellow diamond ring. She was, from the outside, every inch the triumphant new woman in Daniel Hartwell's life. She did not know that Daniel had been commingling client funds to pay for her lifestyle. She did not know about the yacht in the Maldives that had been purchased with money that technically belonged to investors. She did not know about the accounting structures that his CFO Richard kept very carefully maintained to keep the numbers looking clean. She thought she had won the prize. She had no idea she had walked into a house that was already quietly on fire, and Daniel did not know what was about to walk through the main doors of Hargrove Hall. He had no idea. He thought tonight was going to be the best night of his year. I arrived at Hargrove Hall at 7:30 in the evening. The building was extraordinary, as it always was. Stone columns and warm gold light pouring out of tall windows, and the sound of a string quartet drifting through the open doors. There was a red carpet and photographers and beautifully dressed people moving through the entrance in clusters. I got out of my car alone, no one beside me, and I walked up those steps with my grandmother's pearls and my ivory silk dress and my low heels, and I held my head up. I gave my name at the door. I walked into the ballroom. I found the museum table. Said hello to my colleagues, sat down. Normal, calm. Present, across the room I could see Daniel's table. He was already there. He was holding court, his voice just a little too loud above the string quartet, gesturing with his wine glass. Sienna was next to him, stunning in her red dress, her ring catching the candlelight deliberately. She leaned across the space between their table and ours at one point and gave me a smile that was pure performance. Small and descending and satisfied, the way someone smiles when they are very sure they have already won. Daniel caught my eye once. He raised his glass very slightly, a tiny toast to his own victory. He was enjoying himself tremendously. I looked back at him and I did not smile and I did not look away. I just looked at him for one steady moment, and then I returned my attention to the person on my left at the museum table, Lord Alastair Harrington, an elderly man who was the Duke of Westbourne's godfather and who had, I would later discover, known exactly who I was and why I had been seated next to him. He was warm and funny, and he made the first hour of the evening pass more easily than I had expected. At 8:15, the string quartet stopped playing. Not between pieces, just stopped. A particular kind of silence fell over the ballroom, the kind that happens when a room full of experienced social creatures all sense the same shift in atmosphere at the same moment. Heads turned toward the main doors. 4 men in perfectly tailored black suits had entered quietly through the double doors at the far end of the hall. They did not look like guests. They moved with a controlled, watchful energy that was entirely different from everyone else in the room. They positioned themselves without drawing attention, and yet somehow the room arranged itself around them instinctively. Then the master of ceremonies at the entrance spoke. His Royal Highness Prince Edward James Ashby, the Duke of Westbourne. Edward walked through the doors. I had seen him in the museum and in the park and standing outside on cold mornings with cups of tea. I had never seen him like this. He wore a midnight blue velvet dinner jacket that was extraordinary, fitted to his shoulders as if it had been made for him, which of course it had. His medals of service, earned during 2 tours of military duty, were on his lapel. He moved through the room with the ease of someone who had been walking into rooms like this since childhood, but there was nothing cold or bored about it. His hazel eyes moved through the crowd with genuine attention, and then he looked at me. He had chosen his midnight blue jacket deliberately. My ivory dress had a sash of the exact same shade of midnight blue at the waist. Rosie had delivered it to me 3 days before the gala without any explanation except that Edward's office had been in touch, and she had been very firmly asked to ensure that I wore it. I had laughed for the first time in weeks. Properly laughed. Every person in that room who understood the social language being spoken in the color of his jacket and the sash at my waist understood exactly what it meant. He was telling them something. He was telling them without a single word. Edward crossed the ballroom. The room parted for him. He came directly to the museum table. He came directly to me. He extended his hand and I took it and he raised it to his lips and he said, "Good evening, Clara. You look beautiful." And his voice was warm and private, just for me, as if no one else in the room existed. I heard the sound of the room react. Not a gasp exactly, more like a collective intake of breath that people tried immediately to cover by reaching for their wine glasses. I glanced across at Daniel's table. He was sitting very still. Sienna had stopped leaning. Her smile was frozen. The yellow diamond ring on her finger suddenly looked very loud in the silence. Here is what happened next, and I want you to understand that I am not exaggerating a single word of it. Daniel Hartwell stood up. He stood up from his table. which was not a small thing at an event like the Hargrove Gala, where protocol and decorum were the entire point. He stood up, ignoring the horrified looks from his tablemates, and he picked up his wine glass, and he began to move through the room toward the head table where Edward had just been escorted to take his seat for dinner. He walked with the particular energy of a man who has decided that the opportunity in front of him is too important to wait for a better moment. He had seen this wrong. He had looked at the situation and calculated that with the Duke of Westbourne here in this room, there was a business opportunity. He had decided that the Duke's well-known interest in sustainable infrastructure investments aligned with Hartwell Capital's current portfolio. He had decided that 2 minutes of Edward's attention before the dinner service began could change the trajectory of his firm. He had decided this was worth the breach of etiquette. He had not put together, yet, what the matching colors meant. He had not understood yet what he had walked into. He was too busy looking at the opportunity to see the trap that had already closed around him. He reached the head table. Edward's protection officers were moving before Daniel had come within 3 meters. One of them, an enormous quiet man, placed himself in Daniel's path with a hand raised. Daniel held up his own hand in a gesture of openness and said something about just wanting one quick word. He was an old friend of the family. Edward raised one finger, just one. A small, contained gesture. The protection officer stopped, stepped back, not away, just back. His eyes remained completely fixed on Daniel. Daniel extended his hand to Edward, his most confident smile. He launched immediately into a pitch, his voice smooth and practiced. He said something about sustainable infrastructure and yield guarantees and ALPRO projections. He said he believed his firm was uniquely positioned to offer the Duke's portfolio a 50% yield increase. He said he had been looking forward to an introduction for some time. Edward looked at Daniel's extended hand. He looked at it the way you might look at something mildly unusual that you had found on a footpath. With no particular feeling and no particular urgency. He did not take it. The silence that followed lasted approximately 3 seconds. In a ballroom full of people who understood exactly what it meant for a royal duke to decline to shake a man's hand, 3 seconds is a very long time. Then Edward spoke. His voice was quiet and completely level. He said, "Mr. Hartwell, I am aware of who you are." He paused. He said, "I am also aware that you are acquainted with my fiancé." He looked across the room to where I was sitting. Several hundred heads followed his gaze. I felt every single pair of eyes. He said, "She has spoken very fondly of your marriage." He let that sit for just a moment, and then his expression shifted very slightly, a cooling, a final closing, and he said, "I would strongly suggest that you enjoy the rest of your evening. It is, I expect, the last pleasant evening you will have in London for some considerable time." He said it without drama, without raising his voice, quietly, the way you state a fact that requires no embellishment. He looked away from Daniel then, not dismissively, simply conclusively. As if the matter was done, Daniel stood there for one more moment. The room was watching. Every single person at every single table was watching. The string quartet had not resumed playing. There was no cover for what was happening. It was open and visible and absolutely clear. Daniel turned and walked back toward his table. His footsteps were quick on the marble, and the sound of them echoed in the quiet room. He did not look at Sienna when he sat back down. He picked up his wine glass and drank from it and stared at the tablecloth. Edward looked at me across the room. His expression was steady and warm. He gave me the smallest nod, as if to say, "It is done." "You are all right." Lord Harrington, sitting next to me, leaned in quietly and said, "Well, I have been coming to this gala for 30 years. I do not believe I have ever seen that before." The string quartet began to play again. "I want to tell you about the 48 hours that followed the Hargrove Gala, because they were extraordinary in a way I could not have predicted even on that extraordinary night. Edward and I left the gala together. His car was waiting at the private entrance around the side of the building. As we walked out, he took my hand and held it, not dramatically, just quietly, the way you hold someone's hand when you want them to know you are there. I had not been able to eat much at dinner. I was running on adrenaline and something that felt very much like joy, but was so unfamiliar I was not quite sure what to do with it. In the car, he asked me if Daniel had hurt me in any of the years I had been married to him, not the financial hurt or the public humiliation. He meant something more direct. I said no, not in that way. He nodded. He said, "Good." He did not say anything else about Daniel that night. The following morning, I woke up at Arthur's country estate in Berkshire, in a guest room with French windows that looked out over the most beautiful stretch of countryside I had ever seen. Sunlight was coming through the glass. On the table next to my bed was a cup of tea with the right amount of milk and a copy of the morning papers. I sat up in bed and opened the Sunday Times. My photograph was on the front page. Not a paparazzi shot, a beautiful photograph taken by the Gala's official photographer, Edward's hand raised to mine, his eyes on my face, the matching midnight blue of his jacket and my sash visible to everyone who looked. The headline said, "From Heartbreak to Highness." How the Duke of Westbourne's mystery fiancé turned the most talked-about night of the year into a love story. The Daily Mail had a longer version. It described the evening in detail. It described Edward's crossing of the ballroom. It described the color coordination that the entire room had noticed. And in the bottom third of the front page, in a section that I read 3 times to make sure I was reading it correctly, it described what had happened to Daniel Hartwell at the head table. It described the declined handshake. It quoted 3 witnesses who had all said essentially the same thing. It described Daniel's return to his table and Sienna's expression. The paper called Daniel a desperate new money grifter who had badly misread the room. Those were not my words. Those were the words of the society columnist who had also been at the gala and who had, apparently, been watching the evening with very careful attention. But the story in the papers was not the worst of Daniel's problems. The papers were the public face of a devastation that was happening somewhere much more damaging. At exactly 9 on Monday morning, Edward's protection officer had a quiet word with someone he knew at the Financial Conduct Authority. This was not, as far as I was aware, Edward's doing directly. It was Lord Alastair Harrington's doing. Lord Harrington, who had sat next to me all evening, and who had known what Daniel had been doing with his client accounts for some time, had simply decided that enough was enough. He had made 2 phone calls on Sunday evening, one to the FCA, one to the board of Kyoto Dynamics. At 9:15 on Monday morning, the glass doors of Hartwell Capital's offices in Canary Wharf opened, and a team of FCA investigators walked through them. The trading floor went completely silent. Daniel walked in at 9:30 with his coffee cup, saw the investigators, and stopped in the middle of the floor. His CFO, Richard, was already in the conference room with his own solicitor. The door was closed. The news spread through the city of London in under an hour. By noon, the Kyoto Dynamics partnership was formally withdrawn. The consortium's CEO issued a brief statement that said his company valued honor and social responsibility above all, and that recent events had given them cause for concern. By 2 in the afternoon, the news was on every financial publication website. By 4, the Harrington Trust, Daniel's largest anchor investor, had issued their own withdrawal citing a clause in their agreement that allowed them to exit in the event of conduct unbecoming. Daniel's assets were frozen. The FCA investigation revealed what Richard had been quietly managing for 3 years, commingling of client funds to sustain a lifestyle of yachts and diamonds and Kensington apartments and bottles of wine at charity galas. The money for the yellow diamond ring had not been Daniel's to spend. I learned most of this secondhand over the following days, sitting at that long mahogany table in Berkshire with the French windows open and the countryside beyond. Edward brought me the papers each morning. He sat with me while I read them. He did not express satisfaction at what was happening. He was not that kind of man. On the Tuesday after the gala, Daniel drove to the Kensington apartment where Sienna was staying. He had been calling her since Sunday night, and she had not answered. When he buzzed the intercom, she let him up. When he came through the door, she was sitting at the kitchen table in oversized designer sunglasses, scrolling through her phone, looking completely unbothered in a way that was so deliberate it was almost performance art. She had a cardboard box on the floor next to the table. Not his things, her things. She had already packed. He dropped his own cardboard box of office belongings onto the floor. The crystal decanter he had kept on his desk, a gift he had bought himself to celebrate his first £10 million fund, shattered inside the box with a quiet crunch. He said, "Sienna, what is this? What are you doing?" She lowered her sunglasses slowly and looked at him over the rim. The softness she had worn at the gala, the bright prettiness and the dazzled admiration was completely gone. What was underneath was much cooler and much more practical. She said, "I am leaving Daniel." She said it without any particular emotion, the way you say it is raining or the train is delayed. A fact, not a decision she was still making, a decision that had already been made. She said, "My publicist has brokered a 7-figure deal for a tell-all interview." She picked up her sunglasses case and put it in her handbag. She said, "The interview is called Surviving the Pariah of Mayfair. It airs next week. Consider it my severance package." She picked up her bag and her cardboard box and she walked out of the apartment. The heavy door closed behind her. Daniel stood in the middle of the kitchen alone. He called his solicitor. His solicitor did not answer. He called Richard. Richard answered and told him in a very short and very flat conversation that the board had voted to bring in external crisis management and that Daniel's access to the office building had been suspended pending the FCA investigation. He told him that the lawyers advising the board had recommended that Daniel have no further contact with any Hartwell Capital employees until the investigation was concluded. Daniel stood on the pavement outside the Kensington apartment building with his cardboard box, the broken decanter glittering quietly inside it, and watched Sienna's car turn the corner and disappear. The street was busy with afternoon traffic. People walked past him on both sides. No one looked at him. No one recognized him. No one stopped. He had spent 11 years of his life building a name that opened doors and heads that turned when he walked into rooms. He had spent those years engineering a version of himself that was powerful and significant and admired. And he had done it at the expense of the woman who had stood next to him through every step of it, who had paid his rent and rehearsed his pitches and smoothed his edges and believed in him before anyone else on earth had. All of that was gone now. The investors, the firm, the fiancé with the yellow diamond ring, the table at the Hargrove Gala, the sense of invincibility. All of it because of a handshake that had not happened, and a pair of colors that had matched across a ballroom, and one quiet sentence from a man who did not need to raise his voice to end you. I did not feel triumphant when I found out about that afternoon on the pavement. I want to be honest about that. I felt something quieter. Something like the feeling when a very long storm finally passes. Not joy exactly, just the feeling of air clearing. 3 months after the Hargrove Gala, Edward and I had a very quiet, very private ceremony in the chapel at his family estate in Berkshire. Just family. Just the people who mattered. My sister Alina cried through the entire thing and kept apologizing for it, and then crying again. Lord Harrington sat in the front row and looked enormously pleased with himself. The papers found out 3 days later. My photograph was on the front page of the Sunday Times again. This time the headline said, "The Duchess of Westbourne." And underneath, "A life beautifully restored." I read that headline sitting at the long mahogany table with the French windows open and the countryside beyond and a cup of tea with the right amount of milk on the table in front of me. Edward was somewhere in the house behind me. I could hear him talking to someone on the phone, his voice warm and calm. The morning light was coming through the windows and landing on everything softly. I thought about the archive in the museum basement. The quiet and the cold and the smell of old paper. The broken and faded things that came to me needing to be made whole again. I thought about the patience that work required. The months of careful attention. The understanding that restoration is never about erasing the damage. You do not pretend the cracks were never there. You work with them. You understand where the break happened and why, and you bring the piece back to life with all of its history still in it, but stable now. Breathing again. Itself again. That is what those past months had been. Not an erasure of everything that had happened. Not a pretending that Daniel had never happened, or that the 11 years had never happened, or that the Tuesday morning with the phone on the bathroom floor had never happened. All of it was still there, held inside me, part of the history of the piece. But I was stable now. I was breathing again. I was myself again. Edward came into the room behind me. He set his phone down on the table and came and stood behind me and looked over my shoulder at the newspaper. He read the headline. He said, "They got one thing right at least." He put both hands on my shoulders, warm and steady, and he said, "You were never not yourself, Clara. I want you to know that. You were always exactly this woman. I just had to be lucky enough to find you in a basement." I laughed. He pulled me up from the chair and held me right there in the morning light in the room with the French windows open and the countryside beyond and the cup of tea going cold on the table. And outside the window the streets of life went on. The hedge fund managers rushed to their meetings. The gossip columnists wrote their columns. The social climbers worked their rooms. all of it carrying on exactly as it always had. But inside that room, in the arms of the man who had drunk tea quietly in a cold archive for 4 months just to be near me, I had everything I needed, everything I had always deserved. And Daniel Hartwell was facing 18 months of FCA proceedings, a civil suit from his former investors, and a tell-all interview that aired on a Tuesday evening and drew record ratings. As for me, I went back to work at the museum the following Monday. There was a 16th century Flemish portrait waiting on the restoration table, damaged, faded, beautiful underneath. Ready to be brought back to life by someone with patience and steady hands and the understanding that broken things, given the right care, can be made whole again. That is what I do. That is who I am. If this story moved you, if it made you feel something real, please give it a like right now. It takes 2 seconds and it means everything to this channel. And if you are not subscribed yet, hit that subscribe button so you never miss a story like this one. We have more coming and you do not want to miss them. Thank you so much for watching all the way to the end. You are exactly the kind of person we make these videos for. Stay tuned for more.